slavery system claims that it expresses the will of the people in the countries of the, quote, free world, unquote. On the other hand, quote, anonymous authority, unquote, and manipulation have replaced overt authority in education, work, and politics. Skinner's values also emerge in the following statement: if we are worthy of our democratic heritage, we shall, of course, be ready to resist any tyrannical use of science for immediate or selfish purposes. But if we value the achievements and goals of democracy, we must not refuse to apply science to the design and construction of cultural patterns, even though we may find ourselves in some sense in the possession of controllers, unquote. B.F. Skinner, 1961. What is the basis of this value in neo-behavioristic theory? What about the controllers? Skinner's answer is that, quote, all men control and all men are controlled, unquote. C.R. Rogers, B.F. Skinner, 1956. This sounds reassuring for a democratically minded person, but is a vague and rather meaningless formula, as soon becomes clear. In noticing how the master controls the slave, or the employer the worker, we commonly overlook reciprocal effects, and by considering action in one direction only are led to regular control as exploitation or at least the gaining of a one-sided advantage. But the control is actually mutual. The slave controls the master as completely as the master the slave, in the sense that the techniques of punishment employed by the master have been selected by the slave's behavior in submitting to them. This does not mean that the notion of exploitation is meaningless, or that we may not appropriately ask cui bono. In doing so, however, we go beyond the account of the social episode itself, italics added, and consider certain long-term effects, which are clearly related to the question of value judgments. A comparable consideration arises in the analysis of any behavior which alters a cultural practice. B.F. Skinner, 1961. I find this statement shocking. We are asked to believe that the relationship between master and slave is a reciprocal one, although the notion of exploitation is not, quote, meaningless, unquote. For Skinner, the exploitation is not part of the social episode itself, only the techniques of control are. This is the view of a man who looks at social life as if it were an episode of his laboratory, where all that matters to the experimenter is his technique and not the, quote, episodes, quote, unquote, themselves. Since whether the rat is peaceful or aggressive is entirely irrelevant in the artificial world. And as if if it were not an episode in his laboratory, where all that matters to the experimenter is his technique and not the, quote, episodes, unquote, themselves, since whether the rat is peaceful or aggressive is entirely irrelevant in his artificial world. And as if that were not enough, Skinner states that the exploitation by the master is, quote, clearly related, unquote, to the question of value judgments. Does Skinner believe that exploitation, or for that matter, robbery and murder are not, quote, facts, unquote, because they are clearly related to value judgments. This would indeed mean that all social and psychological phenomena, if they can also be judged as to their value, cease to be facts which can be examined scientifically. Note, by the same logic, the relation between torturer and the tortured is, quote, reciprocal, unquote, because the tortured, by his manifestation of pain, conditions the torturer to use the most effective instruments of torture. One can explain Skinner's saying that slave and slave owner are in a reciprocal relationship only by the ambiguous use he makes of the word controlled, in the sense in which the word is used in the sense in which the word is used in real life. There can be no question that the slave owner controls the slave, and that there is nothing, quote, reciprocal, unquote, about the control except that the slave may have a minimum of counter-control, for instance, by the threat of rebellion. But this is not what Skinner was talking about. He speaks of control in the very abstract sense of the laboratory experiment into which real life does not intrude. He actually repeats in all seriousness what has often been told as a joke, the story about a rat that tells another rat how well it has conditioned its experimenter. Whenever the rat pushes a certain lever, the experimenter has to feed it. Because neo-behaviorism has no theory of man, it can only see behavior and not the behaving person. Whether somebody smiles at me because he wants to hide his hostility, or a salesgirl smiles because she has been instructed to smile in the better stores, or whether a friend smiles at me because he is glad to see me, all this makes no difference to the neo-behaviorist. For a, quote, a smile is a smile, unquote. That is, that it should make no difference to Professor Skinner as a person is hard to believe unless he were so alienated that the reality of persons no longer matters to him. But if the difference does matter, how could a theory that ignores it be valid, unquote? For